Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, part of the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we discuss how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, we will introduce the concept of the Overton Window. This idea describes how the contemporary sensibilities of society, depending on whatever context you happen to be inhabiting at any given moment in time, shapes what is acceptable or unacceptable. Crucially, while ideas of acceptability might be, to some extent, helpful, given that they can smooth the process of difficult social interaction, they can also greatly constrict conversation and thereby inhibit the ability to raise possible solutions to difficult and pressing social issues. Okay, hello everybody. So today we're going to be focusing on an article by a chap called James R. Otteson, which is called Escaping the Social Pull: Nonconformists and Self-Censorship. So you probably have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about. Obviously links into a lot of the stuff that we've talked about before, which is the perils, if you like, and the pull of conformity and nonconformity. In this article, it introduces a concept that I think many of you will be familiar with or will have heard something about in passing, which is the Overton Window. And before we go on, let's just give a little quick definition of that, and then we'll focus in on more detail. So the Overton Window is essentially what can you say and what can't you say? What is the range of acceptable opinions and utterances that come from those opinions? Now obviously this shifts, according to whatever time you live in. So for example, and whatever place as well. So you can imagine if you were in the 1950s in the Deep South, in some circumstances, in certain contexts, you might have been able to get away with saying some quite racist things at that time in that place. And that would have, well, maybe even still, I don't know, I've never been there, so I don't want to, I have to say, actually, the people I've met from the Deep South have been absolutely lovely. And so going on that sample, I can't make that judgment. But then again, I guess even within and this is an important point, even within, the educated bastions of progressivism in North America, for example, New York, I would be surprised if there weren't some communities, some places there where you couldn't get away with saying some quite racist things. I'd even be surprised if you didn't get awarded social status for expressing some quite racist opinions within, again, certain bastions within the North.
And it doesn't have to be race either, right? We could talk about, gun control, certainly abortion. The article actually mentions Obama, President Obama, and how when he was running for president, he endorsed a civil union over same-sex marriage. And that at the time was, I wouldn't say, wasn't horribly progressive, but it was certainly within, normal range of discussion. But then he moved, and as society moved, then eventually endorsed
right. So I mean, if we think about
marriage.
as little as 15 years ago, you could still, on the one hand, identify and be identified by other people as being a progressive, yet on the other, opposing same-sex marriage. It was perfectly okay to oppose same-sex marriage, and people may have disagreed with you. Lots of people would. I mean, I would have. I did then. But lots of progressives would have disagreed with you, but you would still be within the progressive camp. That point of view was one of the acceptable points of view, and you wouldn't necessarily be dismissed as homophobic by saying something like that. Not then, anyway.
Right. So it's like, I agree that, people of same sex should be able to live together and maybe file their taxes together, or certainly be able to help each other with, if one's in the hospital, the other should be allowed to visit and to help make medical decisions and that kind of thing. But I don't necessarily think they should get married, right? And people would say, oh, well, you're still within that that range. And one of the ways that I was describing just the other day, the Overton window, to someone was in terms of somebody, in sort of machining, I said, specs, right? Specifications. So there's this range. Maybe you measure the gap in a spark plug, right? And it can be within a certain specification, and that still, it still fits. It doesn't have to be, there's a range, right? And some machinery or some cars or some, whatever, you have a wider range. What's a pinch of salt, right? You have like a wider range, and other times the specifications are quite tight. And so that would be a narrow Overton window versus a wider Overton window.
In terms of machines, the classic example would be a watch. So on the one hand, you might have a quartz watch like this one. And a reasonably good quartz watch, the range of acceptable deviations from time would be plus 2 or 3 seconds a week, maybe plus 2 or 3 seconds a month. Now, if you go to a high-end automatic watch, which is not being powered by, it's not electronic, it's much more difficult to get them that accurate, and so therefore the range of acceptable deviation from time might be plus 15, minus 15 seconds a day for a pretty decent Seiko, for example. A little bit less for a Rolex and a Patek Philippe or something like that. But even a really expensive watch would, if it's an automatic, it has less of an acceptable window than a quartz does. So it's that deviation from the norm.
I have a tide clock on my wall here because I live near the ocean. And so I jog down there. And so, if I want to run actually on the beach, it matters where the tide is. And the tide clock, for example, only responds to the moon. However, there's also a pull of the sun. So its accuracy is variable depending on the time of the month. It might be as much as a half an hour wrong.
Which could have fatal consequences depending upon where you are, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it could, yes. And depending on how strong the wind and all that kind of stuff, yes.
I think near Liverpool in the UK, there was some illegal immigrants and they were doing cockle picking up clams. And they miscalculated the tide. Yes. And the tide just came in really, really quickly and a lot of them died. So, yeah, it's important. And similarly with the Overton window, you're not going to die. Well, hopefully not. We might be heading in that direction. Well, certainly. No. Well, look, let's put it another way. Certainly, in some countries, if you said something that was outside of the Overton window of what was acceptable, for example, Russia. In Russia right now. I remember speaking to a Russian friend recently, and she was saying the thing is about Russia is before the invasion of Ukraine, all of the laws were set up in order to stop you speaking out against the state. However, and if you broke one of those laws, then you'd be in a lot of trouble. However, the laws were still the laws, right? So there were still ways to get around the laws, and there were still certain things that you could say that weren't covered in the laws, and the state couldn't come down on you if you did it, if you played the game. And now...
Or maybe even they didn't bother with certain things that were at the margins. But now what she said is it's changed from being this kind of system in which you've got all of these horrible laws to being a system in which the kind of horrible laws are just amorphous. So if you say something that's outside of that kind of boundary, they'll come and get you anyway. So it's gone from being a system in which the Overton window was well defined to one in which the Overton window has shrunk. And it's done so by amorphous laws, by kind of laws of which the boundaries are really, really blurred. So one of the things that they describe in the article is when the Overton window is wider and flatter, basically, a bigger window, maybe more like a picture window. Typically, it's an issue where there's no consensus yet. Maybe there's still a lot of discussion. Less is known. Maybe if we think about maybe COVID or something, maybe there's like more. it's like, oh, people are wiping down their groceries. That's still okay because we don't really know yet about what the virus. So less is known, maybe a new issue, no real consensus yet. Also, oftentimes an issue that considered of less importance. So while, so people aren't all necessarily riled up about it. So if you're you can be in the window for a while. You might be different, but again, still acceptable to the group. And then as an issue maybe becomes more important, or people sort of they're inside the window start to reinforce each other, the window gets, a little bit narrower. People at the margins are no longer in the window. So your opinion might not have changed at all. So I'm reminded of
Colin Wright.
Was it Colin?
Yeah.
Colin Wright's little comic strip that he wrote, where he's still in the same place, right? And everything, he's still left of center, but everyone else on the left has switched, has deserted him. Sort of a similar kind of little comic kind of thing, only in this case, it's this window of space. So now you are different. When the Overton window shrinks, people often gain a moral superiority. And in psychology, we sometimes call this group polarization, where people flock to a pole. So they go, and it's not, polarization is not necessarily just going to opposite poles, right? Everyone often shifts. So if you think about jury deliberations, one of the reasons why lawyers, let's say in a civil trial, they offer a large, they say, we want, $10 million. Okay. And you might think, oh my God, $10 million when, the person, just got, they got some burns that they recovered from, or they hit, whatever, like, why $10 million? Well, that becomes the anchor, right? And then people sort of adjust based on the anchor, and what happens is when somebody says, oh, I do think, I'm going for $9 million. And they make their argument or whatever. And once people start to sort of move in that direction, everybody wants to be more of what everyone likes. So as we like that better, everyone wants to say, oh, I agree even more, or I have even more arguments in favor of that. And it contributes to this sort of narrowing and movement towards maybe one end of a spectrum, whether that's a jury award or whether that's a political ideal. And so they gain this moral superiority. And so not only does the idea that used to be on the margins, that's now on the outside, get rejected, but now also the person becomes wrong, not just different. Maybe you were different before because you were on the margins, but still in the window. But now you're demonized. You're
right.
morally,
so
you're morally wrong.
And this is one of the things that, like,
right.
one of the points that I really struggle with people, and I have done for a long time. Somebody will say, okay, person X is a conservative, or on the other side, they will say person Y is a liberal, depending upon which tribe of person I'm talking to. And they are tribes, right? Because, often these conservatives and liberals don't know nearly enough about their own political philosophy to call themselves either. So the labels are pretty arbitrary. But I'll speak to them and they'll give me an example of why something is wrong. Why this person has said is wrong. And then the conclusion, The implicit conclusion is this person has said something that I believe I can show is wrong, whether they can or they can't, using rational argument and evidence. Again, whether they can or they can't, they believe that they can do those things. So we say, okay, let's give you that. Let's say that you can, through rational argument and evidence, show that this person is wrong. And let's go even a step further. Let's say you can show by rational argument and evidence that this person is wrong, but also you can show that if what they were proposing should happen to society does come to pass, then society will be significantly worse off as a consequence. So you can say all of those steps. You still can't reasonably conclude that that person is evil. Right? Them having bad arguments, not enough evidence, and therefore suggesting changes that will be, on balance, worse for society. You can say that the consequences will be worse, if you thought it through well enough and you have the evidence. But you certainly can't conclude that that person is evil. And yet they do. And again,
yet they do.
And by the way, I don't want to demonize the people who are doing this either. This is not a partisan issue. This is something that's...
It's human nature, unfortunately.
Again, I listen to the kind of the fringe lefty stuff. So I listen to Democracy Now! And I also listen to... And I don't think that they're bad people, by the way. And I listen to, this kind of firebrand right-wing talk show host called Dan Bongino. And I don't think he's a bad guy either. I don't think any of them are bad people. I think that their vision for America would be kind of quite similar. One would have guns, the other would not have guns, but nobody would be shooting each other. Neighborhoods would be safe, things would be clean, people would be looking after each other. What they want, their ends are pretty similar, but the way they want to get at it is quite different. And so somebody like him will,
right?
He'll point to some of the bad actors on the so-called, let's call it the progressive side, and there are many, because there are bad actors on both sides. And then he'll do the usual thing, which I've talked about many times, which he'll extrapolate from the actions of one bad actor that you can therefore demonize a whole swathe of people who identify with progressive politics. And that's absolutely wrong and dangerous. And the left do it too.
And this demonization, this demonization is what, sort of drives us to remain silent, right? To not speak up. We don't necessarily have to change our views. People often do, but, we also just simply remain silent. And that's what one of the things the author is saying here is that all they have to do is judge us negatively, begin to create social distance between us and them. And, then as de Tocqueville suggests, social ostracism, which is worse than death. So this author is saying, the larger danger here is that we will become conformists. That's the larger danger.
I want to give some context to that, because, the Overton window... The changes in the Overton window can exert extreme psychological pressure that will make you either change your opinion, and it does change some people's opinions, or make you pretend that you've changed your opinion. But the evidence, as far as I'm aware of, the evidence from political science, for example, seems to show that actually that's quite rare. That it's quite rare that people will actually change their political opinions. And so if you look at the what we would call the critical social justice, you might call it more colloquially woke, domination of elite institutions. So, for example, legacy media, social media, the universities, the upper echelons of corporate America, and so on. That's all happened. It's not clear, that's all happened in a narrative sense, in the sense that, these are the narratives that are coming from these places. It's not clear that they actually dominate them, that actually a majority of people in those institutions believe in this stuff. It's possible that the Overton window has shrunk so that these are the views that are, these are the views that you can only express. Whereas a majority of people in those institutions, right. I think it's probably likely that a majority of people within those institutions actually disagree with the views that are acceptable within the Overton window, and certainly within the wider society, within the wider society, because there is hard evidence of that.
Right. Or, maybe they don't disagree, but they did not have a strong opinion. And as you've pointed out, are not, were not widely read about, something. And so therefore, while they're not sort of political activists or actively participating, they do stay at the margins and stay silent at the margins. And so I don't even know if a lot of people necessarily disagree. I think maybe a lot of people are more in this camp where it's like, I don't want to, I don't want to comment on that kind of thing. I don't want to get involved. I want to stay in my, especially in academia, I think, or maybe even at work, when people are at work and they want to kind of, stay out of it. And so unfortunately, by staying out of it, it's, we're losing voices.
But you would have
right?
thought within academia would be the last place where people wouldn't know. One actually wouldn't think. One ought to think. One ought to be surprised by this, right?
Yes,
and journalists similarly, right? Journalists are a kind of intellectual, and one would think, right, or one ought to think, that journalists would be maybe not as equipped as academics, but pretty well equipped.
I was going to say, and by the way, I just read this little article, and in journalism, they call this pack journalism, where they're like sort of like a wolf pack, and they all sort of agree on, a perspective, and it's the pressure to get news out, quicker and faster and everything. They all sort of coalesce on some facts, share some things. And so there's very little sort of variety. So I had not heard that.
That's a good term.
Term sort of,
for context with the pack journalism thing that I've observed, because I've got a few journalist drinking buddies, although increasingly less because I'm getting cross with them. Because of their conformity, right? A lot of them are old school kind of 1980s, 1990s left-wing socialists, for whom, things like freedom of speech are absolutely paramount. That's kind of baked into their identities, not just as being left-wing, but as being journalists, right? Because of course, you want to push back against government censorship, or at least you used to want to push back against government censorship. Now, as we've seen with the Twitter files, kind of the security state has pretended to be left-wing and so has co-opted a lot of these people. But what they do is they've got all these left-wing ideas, and they think, oh, okay, these young people, okay, they've got a few funny ideas and they might do a little bit of a dangerous thing here and there, but their hearts are in the right place and they're on our team. And it's like, no, they're really not on your team. They're not liberals. You actually have more in common from an ideological point of view with people on the center right. These old school left-wing 1980s, 1990s socialists have more in common with people on the center right, because people on the center right would agree with freedom of speech, democracy, allowing left-wing governments to be elected if they win the popular vote, for example, or equally right-wing ones. So these old school leftists, they have more in common with people on the center right, and yet they will still ally themselves with these, much younger woke bullies who are superficially left-wing, but certainly not liberal and essentially authoritarians. But because of that tribalism, again, like you use the term pack journalism, that tribalism shifts them into a group with these people, even though they don't like them.
Yeah, and so one of the things that happens is, once a group coalesces, sort of, like you start to believe you're part of an in-group, right? And we identify with those groups. There is some pressure within that group to engage in censorship, to protect the group, right? And we actually, we talked about this in the Spiral of Silence, not yet released podcast, the Spiral of, it will be, and that it does become this cyclical process, right, where there's a natural tendency to sort of keep the in-group presented in a positive light. And so maybe behind closed doors, there's more tolerance of some deviation, but you must not, deviate sort of outside of the in-group. And again, this sort of perpetuates this moral authority within the group and this narrowing of what's
it starts off in a very benign
acceptable
way, though, doesn't it? Like for example, let's say you've got an uncle who is a full-on QAnon, Trump supporting. I'm not saying all Trump supporting people are QAnon, right? But some of them are. Let's say he's full on, he's, flying the Confederate flag and all this kind of stuff. He's into all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't follow from any of that he's a racist, by the way. But he's your uncle and you love him. He's a good bloke. He's a bit eccentric. He believes some crazy stuff. He believes some crazy stuff. But you can't talk him out of that argument. But you also know he's a force for good in the world. He's decent. He looks after his kids. He contributes to charity. All of that kind of thing. So but many of us have family members and friends who are quite like that, who have some kind of strange beliefs, but are basically decent people. So how do you interact with those people? Do you challenge them? Do you
Well, yeah, right. Well, and I think that, when in reading about, self-censorship and stuff, this is one of the causes of self-censorship is simply that, this sort of almost fatalistic, it's futile to fight. And so, that's why I mentioned, whether people disagree or whether they just sort of shrug and, like you were saying, well, their heart's in the right place. And so I'm not going to challenge them. I don't disagree strongly enough. A lot of people will say that they don't feel that they know enough. They don't feel comfortable maybe engaging, and so they don't say anything for those reasons. So I do think there's certainly there's just this really strong pressure to either conform or keep our mouths shut. And I really need to read this. I certainly am familiar with Glenn Lowry and the Velvet Glove, quotes and stuff. But this is de Tocqueville from 1835. So I'm sure you're probably already familiar with this. I didn't know this, but here is a quote from 1835, and this is his. Apparently he came to America to sort of study, like, what the heck is this America thing? This is like great America thing. So he comes and spends some time here. And this is the first quote. This is very complimentary of the United States. As soon as some inhabitants of the United States have conceived of a sentiment or an idea that they want to bring about to the world, they seek each other out. And when they have found each other, they unite. From that moment, they are no longer isolated men, but a power that, seen from afar, and whose actions serve as an example, a power that speaks and to which you listen. And so he's being somewhat complimentary, and this complimenting intellectual discourse and moral engagement, civic engagement, and that kind of thing. But he's talking about that associational life also has a dark side. So listen to this. Yes, exactly. The master no longer says, "You will think like me or die." He says, "You are free not to think as I do. Your life, your goods, everything remains with you. But from this day on, you are a stranger among us. You will keep your privileges as a citizen, but they will become useless to you. If you aspire to be the choice of your fellow citizens, they will not choose you. And if you ask only for their esteem, they will still pretend to refuse it to you. You will remain among men, but you will lose your rights to humanity. When you approach your fellows, they will flee from you like an impure being. And those who believe in your innocence, even they will abandon you, for people would flee from them in turn. Go in peace. I spare your life, but I leave you a life worse than death.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that's where I'm living. That's where I'm living, and many obviously many people like us. So very from 1835 there. So our fellow citizens represent a danger, as the article that we're talking about specifically, but our fellow citizens represent a danger to our liberty, not because they threaten us physically all the time. Certainly that's a threat, but because they have the power to remove us from group life. And we need groups. And the article that we read, this Otteson, articles, Escaping the Social Pull, is, focusing, it's a little bit on academia, and this pull. But, certainly we can expand this, to, like you said, the our family life and our work life. We talked about workplace mobbing and this, getting outside the window.
In terms of the academic thing, let's give a little bit of context. The people that are writing these papers, they're academics. And so naturally, their first instinct is to frame it in the context they are most used to. It doesn't follow from that it doesn't work in other contexts as well, especially as a lot of these contexts, be it journalism, the upper echelons of corporate America, and so on and so forth, are informed by academia as well, because in order to get to one of those places, you will have had to have spent some time passing through academia, at the very least as an undergraduate, and increasingly, even that's not sufficient anymore.
Right.
So yeah, academic context exists within corporate America as well, and the ideas that inform. I hesitate to call it an ideology, but that works for now. The ideas that inform the ideology that permeates these places are very much of academia. So you can have an academic context without being in a university, right?
And you would think that it would be the last place, but it's certainly.
Okay. So you think that it would be the last place? Because of the espoused ideals of academia, right? And yet, communism pretty much rose out of the academy as well, and that was another, highly intolerant movement. I think, and I'm going to channel my conservative philosopher side here. I'm not saying I am a conservative philosopher, but I'm in touch with the spirit of Edmund Burke, and he's going to speak through me. I think that there is a thing about academics, in that they realize that they are far smarter than the average person out there. And by and large, although not exclusively, because there are a few dum-dums in academia, like seriously, quite a few, like actual dum-dums in academia. And this has been made possible.
Yeah. You just have to, you have to persevere a lot. You have to have and you have to be conscientious enough to meet deadlines and to that kind of stuff. So you don't.
But no, there are quite a few actual dum-dums. Seriously, like really. I've worked with them, like dumb, lower average IQ and level of overall knowledge, I would say, than the average person out there. And a lot of this has been enabled by autoethnographies and stuff like that, where you can just, do a PhD writing about how wonderful you are or how oppressed you are, which is the same thing, by the way. How wonderful you are and how oppressed you are is often the same thing. And that's a PhD.
Have you noticed too that they are far more impressed with their PhD? Like, I'm not that impressed with my PhD. But have you noticed that some people that you think maybe shouldn't be too impressed with theirs are very impressed with their PhD? Are there people
who are very smart, who have done very high-level PhDs, who parade around boasting about it? There are, but not that many. No,
but not too many.
And I can't internalize any of my achievements, because I always think that Christ, I'm not where I want to be, and
Yeah, they're all in the past.
And also,
too.
It's kind of
what
like,
have I done?
There are so many dum-dums with PhDs that like it doesn't really say much about me. Actually, I'm kind of like, and so consequently, like when I, where I would much rather be recognized is people. Oh, I spoke to Mike and he came across as being knowledgeable and bright, because that's much more tangible and real. I'm not saying that a PhD isn't tangible and real, but it has been cheapened, unfortunately. There's this kind of like academic inflation going on because of the dum-dums. But anyway, in spite of the dum-dums, and there are quite a few of them, a college professor is likely to be slightly more intelligent, quite a bit more intelligent than the average person on the street. Certainly more well-read as well. And what this does, I think, is it leads them to fall in love with themselves. And in particular, the ideas, yes.
And with their ideas.
And so they, they think, well, I'm so much smarter than everybody else. I've read so many books than everybody else. I work at a so much more prestigious university. Of course, I know what the best course of action is. And often they don't. And Edmund Burke's point was actually the people who generally know the best course of action are the people closest to the problem. And this is why England was a nation of shopkeepers, right? You try and devolve the problem solving. And this is kind of feature of liberalism too, right? Where you're moving away from centralized planning, because even if the person who is at the absolute core is some incredible genius, they still don't have the combined cognitive capacity of lots of people of average intelligence, people who are working close to the problem that they're engaged with. And this is why centralization doesn't work.
All you have to do to really witness, you get a bunch of smart people with PhDs in a department meeting. Oh my God. And the truth of the matter is everything that, because these are intelligent, well-read people, they genuinely have, something relevant and, decent to contribute. Except that what happens then is that nothing ever gets done, because everyone is contributing their, thoughtful, relevant, insightful comment. And so there's no end to that. There's just no end to that. It's the most useless waste of time,
this problem being lost in the infinite, right? So it's like, how do I make a decision between path A and path B? And to a certain extent, you do have to put some rational reflection into that. You don't just jump, okay, B sounds cool, so I'm going this way. No, you should think about it. But you can also be paralyzed by constantly thinking about it and reevaluating it and think, well, path B might be changing over time, and so we need to... And you end up actually achieving absolutely nothing, because you're lost in these infinite kind of potential paths that you can take, or potential reasons to take A over B or B over A, and yet it's completely paralyzing.
And they'll form subcommittees, and then the subcommittee will come to the big department meeting and present their findings, and people will just be like, we can't possibly make a decision on it. We all have to investigate everything. You must report back every aspect of your investigation. It's the most ridiculous.
You would have been better off taking a leap of faith, because at least you would have had a chance of adapting to the situation as it comes. Even if you're going by, to use an Americanism, the seat of your pants, you would have had a chance to adapt on the fly, right? But if you're just stuck and debating, you have no chance. You're dead. You have no chance to adapt. You can't adapt to anything, because you can't make a decision in any way. Your whole organizational structure is now ossified. Even if it seems like it's a great kind of place for debating.
So even if so one of the things that this article talks about is like what a force of character it takes to be the person who is willing to be at the margin, to speak at the margins, to be a dissenter. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about briefly was this aspect of uncertainty. So even if you have the force of character, if you have any humility at all, you would also wonder, right? Like if I'm so outside this Overton window, how do I know that I'm not wrong? And I do think this happens to a lot of people. Again, if you don't know a lot about a topic, or if you maybe feel that people's lived experience is it makes sense what you're saying, your description of what happened, and I certainly have never had that personal experience, so you sort of give, what right do I have to question that or whatever. And so this uncertainty in the face of certainty, in this group, I think makes it difficult for even people who are very strong, especially again if they spend time in that self-reflective loop that you're talking about, where there's it's like, I don't know, is this worth it? To really mention that I'm outside looking in, into the window.
I have something to say on that. So for example, if you're one of these people who is, you have the moral strength to push back against the excesses of the critical social justice lot, or if you're another type of person, somebody who has pushed back against the excesses of the critical social justice lot and is now pointing out the problems with the resistance to the critical social justice lot, which is that they seem to be, not all of them, of course, but some of them seem to be becoming the mirror image of that which they set out to oppose. And that gets a lot of pushback as well. Like I've got a lot of pushback on that. I've been alienated because of that too. So if you are one of those people and you do have the rectitude, the strength of character to push back, good on you. How do you know that you're right and the majority are wrong? Well, read their literature.
Well, also you just don't too. I mean, I guess that's part of my point here is that we don't always know, and that, I mean, again, in the article, they're asking us to think about in Adam Smith's terms, right? This an outside observer. Okay. And so that you don't have to know whether you're right, that there's other aspects that might help you to say something.
Let me just raise a point here, because I'm going to kind of conjure up another outside observer, right? So there's the outside observer that we would think who is the kind of the impartial person, the kind of God, for lack of a better word, right? I mean, yeah.
Or your future self.
There is something a bit transcendental about it, whichever way you look at it, right? The future self is transcendental, the God is transcendental. It is a higher power, whether that higher power is your future self or something else. And I'm not saying by higher power, I don't mean supernatural, although it could be that if you want it to be. I mean a higher moral power is essentially what I'm getting at here. Mm-hmm. But even before we get to that higher moral power, one of the things that I think is worth doing is and this is what has worked for me, is, when somebody is bullying you according to critical social justice terms. For example, here's a common one. When somebody who's going after you because you're white and abusing you because you're white, and you're saying this and this, you're just a white person, rah, 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 rah. That's somebody that doesn't really understand critical social justice, because that point of argument is actually never justified in critical social justice. Critical social justice would argue that whiteness comes as a consequence of the reification of the white race in order to justify previous horrors in centuries past of colonialization and slavery. It doesn't say that there is anything inherently wrong genetically with being white. It would actually say that the white race in that sense is a biological fiction. It doesn't really exist. So therefore, if somebody is bullying you because you're being white and subjecting you to anti-white racist abuse, which is what some of these people do, it betrays the fact that they don't understand their own literature. So if they're coming out with that nonsense, and many of them do, then that's one way of knowing that they're in the wrong, because they're in the wrong, not just according to the higher power that you might want to invoke at a later stage, that being the ideal arbiter, your future self, whatever. They're even wrong according to the higher power that they would want to invoke, which is the being that would understand their literature really, really well. So often these people, when they're bullying you, the literature they're using, it's not really based in the literature. They're just kind of grabbing onto whatever they can find to beat you around the head with. And that's one way of knowing that, because this happens all of the time, right? The people who are doing all the cancelling, they're not bright, they're not well-read. This is one way of knowing that they're full of shit, essentially, because they're not really channeling their own literature. And you can find that out quite easily.
Yeah, okay, maybe you can. Maybe people like you can.
You can? Maybe. Anyway, so do you want to get onto the...
I guess can. There's a difference between can, are most people capable of it? Sure. I do believe that most of us don't feel ready in the moment to do what you are usually ready to do in the moment, and don't feel the same confidence. And I think, so often, it's like, oh, I wish I would have said, or I could have said, or, all those kinds of things.
So before we go any further,
I think
reminds
that
me of a conversation we were having the other day about muscle memory, right? Like,
oh, right. Not so much
muscle
muscle memory specifically, but basically, slow learning produces fast responding. So it takes there's a very long learning curve for most things that come, what we would say, reflexively or instinctively. So it is not really enough to say, oh, I'm going to go read, whatever, Robin DiAngelo's book, or I'm going to read, and then I'm going to be ready, right? Because it's not, it's not fluid yet. Look how long it took you to learn to walk, right? And so now you walk, talk, chew gum, you do, like talk on your phone, we do all these things all at once, because walking is reflexive. And so you might think that that's a silly example, but think about language and how complex language is, and how long it took us to develop those skills. And now it's, we're relatively, fluid in that. And so I think that you in particular are more, you're more well-read in this area. You're practiced, and in part because it's something that you enjoy doing. You enjoy engaging with people on these things. And so you are, it's more fluid for you, and you have invested a lot of time and thought in that. And so you are, from long learning, from slow learning has come, quick responding.
My only point was that you've just made for me, thank you very much, is that it's not unique to me. This ability can be acquired. You just need to practice. And if and look, these people they're not very, they usually fall back on the same rhetorical devices that are not particularly sophisticated. Learn them a few times. If you've got a partner, get them to come out with the same kind of nonsense at you, and just practice going off at each other. It won't take you very long before you're quite easily able to deal with the vast majority of these people. Don't overestimate your enemy.
Well, it has taken me 2 years, to get maybe like, I don't know, even a quarter of the way of where you are. And I did go off on a 45-minute tirade just a couple of weeks
Facebook.
ago.
So like, you see, this is the difference between, I have this constant drip feed of kind of rhetorical arguments of idiots that I've just been battering
Facebook
away on
and
my
Twitter
mobile
and
phone,
all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And then in real life, it's
not,
like, come on.
Yeah, not on the.
Okay.
So this, in the article, this sort of dilemma, right, of speaking out. The author is asking us to consider Smith's, judicious, well approbated, single wise man gives heartfelt satisfaction to all that noisy applause, of 10,000 ignorant, though enthusiastic admirers versus, right? Do we pay attention to the 10,000 enthusiastic, ignorant admirers, or do we pay attention to the, sort of imaginary spectator that, the actual spectators or the imaginary spectator? And I do believe that giving thought to our imaginary spectator is another path to helping us decide whether and when to speak up, and having this idea of how will this imaginary spectator, how will history, how will my my offspring or whatever consider my choices? And there's certainly value in holding your tongue, and the civility aspect, the humility that says, I don't know a lot about this, maybe I should just listen for a while, right? There's a lot of value in that. And at the same time, sort of thinking about that spectator. And again, you know more about Adam Smith than I do, so I'm going to let you sort of pontificate maybe about that a little bit.
So we're talking about the imaginary spectator. Okay, so I'll try and kind of put it in more contemporary terms. So imagine you have given a presentation, and everybody in the room is indifferent or maybe doesn't like it. And then people start filtering out of the room and your confidence is really, really low, and you're thinking, I didn't do very well, that maybe that reflects poorly on my knowledge and my ability to present. Whatever, your confidence has taken a hit. And then suddenly a Steven Pinker, for example, a really well-known intellectual approaches you, engages with you, and then gives you several reasons why what you've said was actually really, really good. Which one is going to be the primary memory? Now, no, the answer is I don't know for you, which would be more important. For me personally, if a room full of people whose worth I did not know and I suspected was low because I didn't feel they'd judged my arguments properly, had said a lot of negative things about me, then that would certainly be bad. I would have preferred something else had happened. But then if a Steven Pinker was to come at the end and then say, actually, it was really wonderful, well, that would be worth the sacrifice for me, right? Because it's like, I don't really value their opinion. I'd rather they liked me. But if they don't, well, that's negative, but it's of limited negative consequences to me, because if they were all woke, they probably wouldn't like me anyway. So, c'est la vie. But if somebody like a Steven Pinker was to come up, who is somebody I rate, who is somebody I know is a decent thinker because I've read all of his books, that would be a sacrifice more than worth it, right? And so what Adam Smith is kind of asking you to do, in a way, is he's saying that probably Steven Pinker isn't going to be present at your presentation. Neither will Aristotle or Socrates or any of the great philosophers. But what you have to do is to kind of imagine the spirit, if you like, of one of these people. And so you conjure up a kind of a thought form. Who am I addressing my presentation to? Who am I addressing my article to? The Bible says, there's some wisdom in that book. The Bible says, thou shalt not cast pearls before swine, right? So, what do you expect? If you haven't been well received by a bunch of conformists who may or may not be idiots, you should expect them to dislike you. You should expect them to kind of throw you out. But more valuable than that is the imagined ideal person who would be able to evaluate your arguments properly and give them the criticism or praise that they deserve. And so this is what Adam Smith is urging people to think about when they're giving these presentations, so that they don't fall victim to mindless conformity, where you're just playing to the crowd. Does that follow? Does that make sense? So that's
Yeah.
one of the things that he talks about. He also talks about the mutual sentiment, the mutual sympathy of sentiments. So let's kind of, again, so this kind of relates to the Overton Window, although it predates it by quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the classic example is, I don't know, what you Americans call locker room humor. Like, you know, kind of the way in which males talk to each other, where they say all kinds of ostensibly disgusting things that are, and the reason that they're being said is because, not because you actually think that the thing you're talking about is funny, but you think that shocking the sensibilities is funny. And so you, as males, you say, you know, a group of blokes will say all kinds of crazy things to each other in a way that you wouldn't do around women, right? And so that's what happens. So if you're with a group, if you're a bloke and you're with a group of other blokes and you're in the pub and you're saying some stupid stuff, and all of your friends are laughing, you can get away with that because you have the mutual sympathy of the people around you and the sentiments. They know that you don't really mean anything like this. They know that you're just doing something stupid. They're not going to judge you. You have their sympathy. They get it, right? They get what it is. They get the context. If you start to introduce women into the balance who don't understand that kind of way, maybe some of them do. I'm sure, in fact, I know some of them do, but many don't. Then you would adjust what you're saying because you wouldn't have their sympathy. They wouldn't understand why you were saying, well, the pattern of humor. And that's normal. There's nothing wrong about that per se. And so that's what he means by the mutual sympathy of sentiments. So when you're telling a joke, you have to be acutely aware of the context, and you have to be acutely aware of do the people you are telling the joke to have your sympathy? Because if they don't, then the reaction could be very, very negative against you, and that might serve as the basis of you being ostracized, for example, or censured in some way.
And once the person is ostracized, it's pretty difficult to recover, right? Again, it is, yeah. It takes courage. And this author actually, talks about how, this sort of, this imagined, sort of audience, how do we judge now, Socrates or, Joan of Arc? They talk about, Galileo and stuff. And it's like, these wonderful, people of history, but these were people who were executed. Right. And so it's great to, not many of us have that courage. And one of the arguments that the author is making is that, oftentimes the people who have that much courage actually, suffer. It doesn't, even if you're not, you're not executed. These kinds of things are happening, certainly all over the world, where people are, jailed or executed. But there is a social execution that that I was reading, that, de Tocqueville quote and stuff, and that. But that those contributions, that by, speaking up and engaging in, offering new ideas, this, sort of entrepreneurial spirit, that the author describes, in terms of ideas or creative endeavors, tends to benefit future generations. So it isn't always, as Socrates and Joan of Arc, but he gives a much more concrete example, right, where someone decides not to work in the same way that his dad did, and he works hard, and he starts a new business, and he does all this stuff, and he finds that he's not really all that happy. But what did he do? Well, he contributed to a new industry and gave people jobs and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes we have to, what would you say, like sort of, console ourselves when we've been otherized to that extent, that maybe we are making,
I think
that we are making a contribution.
His observation here is correct, but I think it's very selective. For every Socrates that was put to death, we have an Alexander Solzhenitsyn who wasn't. Somebody who endured the gulag and went through hell, definitely, but was recognized within his own lifetime as having made a massive contribution. We have a Martin Luther, the original Martin Luther. I cannot going against one's own consciousness is neither right nor safe. I cannot and will not repent. Here I stand. So help me God. Speaking up against the church at a time when the price for heresy was ritual disembowelment on stage. At that time, contemporary heretics would have their eyes plucked out with hot pokers and, really killed in a slow, horrible way in front of people. Really, that's what happened. And so there have been brave people who have been celebrated for being brave within their lifetimes. Again, another one who went through hell. Martin Luther didn't really go through hell, by the way, but another one who went through hell but was celebrated a lot within his lifetime, Nelson Mandela, who suffered. And I would say, if you want to walk the path of any significance at all, can you really do it without suffering? Maybe you can if you're a professional football player or an athlete or something like that. Maybe, although I expect the sacrifices they have to make. Maybe I don't know. I'm saying, can you? I'm not saying you can.
Well, they get. I think I've always laughed. Like if I had a kid who was a professional football player, you want them to be the field goal kicker. So they make millions of dollars, right? Because they go on they're protected by a line. Nobody actually tackles them usually, because sometimes happens. But their whole thing is they just kick the ball through the uprights for the extra point or whatever. And so it's like, but everyone else gets beat to shit, right? But he really usually doesn't. So
if you look at the number of American football players, for example, who kill themselves because of brain injuries that have spurred on depression and things like that, that happens. Similarly,
yeah, and even if they don't, they certainly suffer, from having been concussed
and also rock stars.
So many times,
how many of them kill themselves aged 27, or just.
I don't know that a lot of them do, but certainly, we've definitely heard about.
My main point being that any path to significance, if you and you are walking the path to significance if you are confident and able to speak out and push back against these people. That's what being significant is. Then that requires sacrifices.
Well, that's what I marked here in this section. That at some point there, some small group who resists, the drive towards conformity. It might just be one person, but it might be a small group saying no to the sort of like the conventional wisdom. So, he's just writing, he says, progress depends on this entrepreneurial innovation. So we should want to nurture and protect those among us of entrepreneurial mindset. And of course, we've been saying several times, that we would think that academia would be, one of the places to do that. At the same time, these people are, he uses the term irksome. They make us uncomfortable, maybe if, when they're outside the fringe or whatever. And so again, this is why sometimes, they get, exiled or whatever. And I was thinking, I would like to think that that's us, people like us, right? That we are, we have that entrepreneurial spirit and that we are speaking up and that maybe
I'm irksome.
Make a difference.
I've certainly got that.
Yes.
Entrepreneurial, I don't know.
Well, I don't think that he's just talking about, you know, idea wise too, right? It doesn't have to be entrepreneurial in terms of building something or whatever, but just, you know, that's what academics are supposed to be doing, right? Thinking about new hypotheses and testing new ideas and putting things together in new, to create a new idea. You know, so yeah, I mean, I'd like to think maybe that
I think so. I think
us,
that we're the people who are trying to grow the Overton window, who are trying to expand. I mean, that's the whole point of liberalism, right? The whole point of liberalism is that, okay, we're going to have a political philosophy that enables for a system of governance wherein as many views as possible are allowed to make a contribution, even intolerant ones. So, you know, Karl Popper, when he talks about the paradox of tolerance, where he says that you can't tolerate intolerant people, he doesn't suggest that the first thing that you should do is act in an intolerant way towards intolerant people. He actually says, look, if you can manage them in the ways of contemporary liberalism, if you can manage them whereas they get to say their piece, but they don't get to coerce anybody, then you can tolerate intolerant people. It's only when they start to get enough power that they can enforce their intolerance upon you, that's when you have to push back against them and be as intolerant as they are. And so that the function of liberalism has always been to keep the Overton window as wide as possible. And that would, for me, include all kinds of reprehensible people with whom I would have an almost violently and inwardly violently, I'm not talking about throwing punches, an inwardly violent reaction to. I mean, I think that horrible racists should be able to make their case. And I would be the first to argue against them. I think that awful people need to be, because these ideas are out there anyway, and they need to be heard so that people can knock them back. If you marginalize them, you play into their narrative, right? The whole narrative of fascism, for example, is that these great ideas that the fascists have about the superiority of race X have been suppressed because of some conspiracy theory, right? Often involving the Jews, which is, of course, complete nonsense. But if you try to suppress it anyway, then they're like, oh, see, we're being suppressed. So it actually plays into their narrative. And that's why you need to.
Well, and we're not learning anything either. I mean, and this, you know, sort of, you know, relates to, you know, the project for which I, you know, that I got canceled for, you know, that my students were doing was, you know, an investigation of rhetoric that was, you know, I mean, 2 words of which were, I don't know if I would even, I mean, they were offensive, you know, certainly. Students are exposed to a lot more people are exposed to a lot more offensive language, but you know, the point is to learn, right? And if we simply ask people, how racist are you? They're going to respond typically within the Overton window, right? Even if that's not what they believe, you know, if they're in a, you know, if they're in a, you know, it's going to be, they're less likely to, you know, to be on the fringe if they're worried that those, you know, will be not tolerated, right? So if you aren't willing to listen, then you're never going to learn about people that are outside the window. And there's a lot of them. I got news for you, right? That the narrower your window, the more people aren't in there, right? And we need to know about these ideas, and we need to, you know, and so I worry in terms of academia specifically, but also, you know, again, to get back to sort of entrepreneurial spirit in other ways, not just in academia, that we are limiting ourselves in ways that, you know, are somewhat terrifying.
Let's think about it this way, right? Let's say that you are going up against somebody in a game of chess, right? And your sole objective is to beat that person at a game of chess. And if you beat that person at a game of chess, you get £1 million, some arbitrary reward, right? How much do you think you would benefit from being telepathic in that sense, right? Imagine you have the ability to read that person's mind. The degree to which you can read their mind, you know, a little bit, a lot, somewhat, will be an advantage relative to how much you can do it, right? So telepathy would be an advantage. Now, if you're an advocate for critical social justice, or equally, if you're an advocate against critical social justice, because this links to the librarian podcast we just did. So you're on the side of critical social justice. You want to push back against the far right. Great. How are you going to do it? You're anti-woke. You want to push back against critical social justice. Great. Great to both of these people, by the way. I push back against critical social justice and the far right. You want to push back. How are you going to do that? What would be the most tactically expedient way of pushing back at these people? And I've alluded to it in this podcast already. Go out and read the literature, learn their moves, learn the way in which they think. But you're never going to learn the way in which they think if you're trying to shut them down. You're just not going to understand.
And like you said, even just listening to this variety, like you said, I listen to these, extreme left. You turn on the news that you don't agree with, right? You read the news. You read the newspaper that you don't, or the news that you don't agree with. You listen to podcasts you don't agree with, right? In order to get exposure to those ideas, and you don't have to necessarily read some of the philosophical literature. There are other ways to get familiar, to get started, to get familiar with the lingo and
deep philosophical
to make
literature,
some of the
because
others.
most of the proponents, even the academic ones, don't read it either. But the point is look. So if you're an advocate for critical social justice and you're trying to push back against the far right, great. How are you going to do it? If you're calling for stuff to be banned or trying to silence voices, you're handicapping yourself. You're not just making yourself look awful and intolerant, which is a handicap in and of itself, but you're preventing yourself from being exposed to the ideas that you need to understand in order to push back, right? You really are handicapping yourself. It's just, and the same is for the anti-woke people too, who are saying, we want to get this book removed from this library here, there, and there. We want to remove white fragility or whatever. I don't think it's a terrible book as well, but read it, and then you arm yourself with the ability to push back. Right. Otherwise, you're just sailing blind. Right. And you make a point, carry on.
And again, this idea that you're getting from being in this small window where you're hearing the same arguments gives you this moral superiority, and you just your mind actually just narrows, right? You become a less good thinker. In fact, I think
while you're searching for that quote, I just want to make the point.
See if I can find
5 cultural minutes ago, we used to think that being narrow-minded was a good thing. No, it was a bad thing. Sorry, we used to think that being narrow-minded was a bad thing. No, good thing.
Yes,
it's a bad thing. Now it seems that being narrow-minded is a good thing. And you can and this tiny shrinking Overton window. Yes, your quote.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can find it. So, and it could be in the other article too. So because I read, the two different ones. So I could be confused. It is in the other article. When we lose the habit of engaging in intellectual challenge, this is from John Stuart Mill, I think. Truth claims are understood lazily and unclearly, and the slow death of intellectual life begins. So when we lose the habit of engaging in intellectual challenge, truth claims are understood lazily and unclearly. I think we have a lot of lazy and unclear thinkers.
Yeah, it's just people who don't. It's kind of a stretch to even call them thinkers, isn't it? Like for me, a thinker would be somebody who would explore ideas for the joy of exploring ideas. Because there is a certain, like as a psychologist, right? So what I've noticed, some of the things that you do, like even with me, like for example, when we were looking at, which will be in another podcast, by the way, which we recorded already, but because of the rebranding, we don't know when it's going to go out. We'll get there. So we looked at the correlation between alt-right types, critical social justice types, and them tending to be disproportionately high, according to one paper, in the psychological traits of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. That we found that psychopathy dropped out a bit, and it was more Machiavellianism and narcissism. And so, the point is somebody like Elizabeth would look like somebody like me who's relatively naive in the psychological literature would just take psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism at face value and say, well, okay, from a naive sense in the common vernacular, these things are bad, right? But then if you're a nuanced thinker on a topic like this, so you've really reflected upon it, you've really thought about it, then you would start to take it apart. You'd take that idea apart and you'd say, well, okay, what about Machiavellianism? Okay, well, obviously, the naive thinking is not completely wrong. We can see that it's obvious that it's bad in some senses, but are there times in which a Machiavellian thinker might be needed? Well, yes. And it's all on the spectrum.
And it's all on the spectrum.
But what I'm saying is
all based on situational
you're taking
content.
these ideas apart and putting them back together again and reconfiguring them. And this kind of narrowing of the window stops you from doing that.
Right. And just like the traits, those dark triad traits, just like that, this social pressure or associational life, the pull, if you will, into those groups is, similarly of evolutionary value, right? It smooths relations. Look, it keeps us from stealing. It keeps us, right? Because that's outside the Overton window, right? Just because you want a piece of candy, you don't just steal it, right? It keeps us with, well, think about speeding as the Overton window, right? Like it's like, oh, you can always go 5 miles over the speed limit and we're still okay, right? Like there's a window there. Right. And then beyond that, we, all these kinds of things, it keeps us in line, like a literal line at, Disney World or whatever, at the store. It keeps you from, pushing the little ladies out of the way at the grocery store. So there's real value in in sort of drawing a fence around, the acceptable kinds of behavior. When that impedes intellectual growth or entrepreneurial spirit or whatever, then, especially, in terms of this author, they're talking about, in academia, but in any other place, then we have, we want to encourage people to, to step outside the box a little bit, right? To speed just a little bit more.
With the example of speeding, for example, we understand what the law for speeding is and why it's there, because if you're traveling at 15 miles an hour and you hit somebody, the damage to that person is less likely to be as high as if you were to hit them at 60 miles an hour. But then, of course, like any other rule, within the UK at least, it gets abused. And so you set the government putting ridiculous speed traps that have no, on roads in which there are no pedestrians, in order to collect revenue. And that's the point, that there are, that rules will be abused, that it is in the nature of human beings to abuse rules, for their own selfish purposes. And that's why there needs to be people who will break them. For example, in Japan at the moment, the social rule is that everybody still wears a mask at all times. Even though the government has said, no, it's okay, you can stop. Like indoors and outdoors, no, it's okay, you can stop. Right. And, are there benefits to that? Well, the literature on wearing masks seems to be, it's not 100% settled, but it seems to be saying.
Yeah. Well, the pollen is really high there right now, so maybe it's
finished, thank God. Yeah, hence
it is.
Okay. Blowing my nose every 25 seconds. It seems to work for pollen, because pollen's pretty big. But for viruses, respiratory viruses, I think that the evidence is now leaning towards it doesn't do much, if anything at all, according to my reading. But, I'm not saying that the question is settled. But in any case, there are certain disadvantages of wearing masks, particularly with communication, particularly for children who are growing up not seeing anybody's face. It was never like that in the United States. Nobody was wearing them all the time outside, I don't think. Were they?
No, very short, very little.
It's been years
time.
in Japan where people just, the vast 85% of people are wearing masks outside. And there are clear costs for that. And so what I'm trying to say is that, the Overton window in Japan is that, you wear a mask outside. You're bringing value to the context by pushing back against that. It's not just you that you're benefiting. So people may look at you and because you're not wearing a mask and they might just think this person is a nonconformist and therefore I don't want anything to do with them. I'm sure there are people who think like that.
Did I ever tell you about the professor that I had in college that did the guppy? No,
you did tell me about this.
You
did.
The guppy
this is a
research,
conversation that we had really early on because I was saying, okay, this is when we first met. I was saying, okay, you're a professor of psychology. So I've been cancelled, but this was like before my biggest cancellation. And I was already taking these people on. So I was like, what is wrong with me? Like, I'm taking these people on. I'm fairly capable of taking these people on, but I'm choosing to take these people on. Like that, and it doesn't have net positive social benefits for me. Some people will take me aside around the photocopier and say, well done, Mike, I really agree. And then in the next breath, go on and go along with all the nonsense, disappear. But nevertheless, that arm around the shoulder in the photocopier room is a nice thing. But the net negatives are negative. And I know that they're negative. And I have the ability to go along with these people as well. So I never knew what it was that was driving me to push back. And then you raised the guppy fish experiment, which, if I'm right, shows that.
Yeah. So he had, female guppies and male guppies, and we had guppies in our fish tank at home when I was a kid, and the male guppies are quite beautiful. They have the big fancy tails and they're colorful. Okay. And the females are just kind of, drab silver fish. But anyway, so you would think, sort of like, think peacocks, for example, with the male big fancy tail and stuff. And you think, oh, obviously even birds, right? The male cardinal is the beautiful cardinal and the female is the more gray with a little bit of red. And so you think, oh, well, they're going to be attracted to the prettier, if you will, more handsome, male guppy, and that's who they're going to want to mate with. And that was true to some extent. However, when they introduced a predator into the fish tank, some of the guppies would actually, most of them would be like, predator, get away, they're going to eat me, right? There would be a couple of guppies who would approach the predator, okay? And, kind of check things out and maybe, whatever. And those guppies were preferred mates for some of the guppies of the opposite sex. The brave ones who survived, of course, some of them got eaten, so they didn't get to procreate. But the brave ones that survived were actually, preferred mates. So there is, and this makes sense, right? That we need all kinds, right? We need the kind that are going to run away from danger. And we also need the kind that are going to approach danger, that are going to learn from danger and actually, survive it and everything. So we need people who are going to go to the moon, right? It's mad. It's madness. Exactly. So we need those extreme personalities. We need some people who score very high in Machiavellianism. We need some people who score very high in narcissism. Some people who score very high in
psychopathy.
Whatever the third one is that I just psychopathy. Because those are people who are taking risks without the normal fear or fear response that's keeping them from approaching something new, something dangerous. They're outside of the Overton window. So yeah, I mean, even guppies, I could also tell a roach story.
I mean, it just reminds me of Milo, like my youngest, who is incredibly brave. And so, like, I think it was 2 days ago, I was telling off the eldest one, Hugo, because he wouldn't go to bed. That's a common thing. And Milo was like, stood up. I will angry to daddy. I was out. Bad boy, this tiny little thing. And he's shouting at me. Another time, I think I told him that there was a ghost outside. I was trying to get him to go to bed. I was like, I will get the ghost, gets outside, runs out into the dark. Ha ha! He's going to go and get the ghost. So he's very, very, very brave.
Yes, but you got to keep your eye on him because he's the one that'll stand at the top of the stairs, right, and just
jump up. That's exactly
what
he does. No, exactly. So like he will literally do kind of like a leap of faith into my arms on the stairs before I've even put my arms.
Yeah.
So he's.
Yeah. You're looking the other direction, and you hear "catch me."
On the spiral staircase, he did it, and had to catch him with one hand, and it can be quite unnerving. He's very, very, very brave.
Yes, but we need this, right? We need all opinions. We need to be tolerant of speech, even that, like you said, we don't want to tolerate, and we need to honor, people who are brave enough to say it, just like people who are brave enough to go to the moon, who are brave enough to approach a potential predator.
Let's be clear by what we mean about tolerating speech that we really don't want to hear. Like, hate speech is real. There is speech that causes harm. I'm not disputing that. Having had to endure bullying as a kid, both and as an adult, yeah, I suppose.
And as an adult.
I've never endured physical bullying as an adult. I've endured physical bullying as a kid, as a teenager, as a young adult, maybe. The verbal bullying is much more harmful than the physical bullying. That's not the point, right? So if you're saying, speech is harmful, therefore we have a justification for outlawing it, I agree with the first part. Speech can be very, 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 very harmful. But the problem is, who gets to say what's harmful? And also, sometimes being harmed a little bit is going to be good for you in the long term. You're not made of glass. You need to know that. You need to endure through some pretty hateful stuff and come out the other end. But also, when I say that, like, I think people should be allowed to say some awful stuff, it doesn't mean that I think that they should say some awful stuff. Right?
Right. They should be allowed
to. We hope they won't. If they said to me, Mike, should I say this? God, no.
Yeah.
Of course you shouldn't say that. It's an awful thing to say. Right. Much more awful thing to believe, let alone say. You don't really believe that, do you? And then I would challenge them on it. I don't think they should say that. I don't think they should believe that either.
You have the right to say it, but please don't.
Some pretty intelligent people make this basic mistake, that just because I think that somebody should be allowed to say something without being prosecuted under the law, that I think that they should say that. I don't think that they should say that. Hate speech is real. Speech that causes harm to people is real. I don't think people should be bullying people and harming each other. I don't. I strongly, 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 strongly disagree with that. But it's a very big difference between me strongly disagreeing with a person doing that and giving some authority the power to punish people. I think that the punishment can be handled by people for the most part.
And I don't think, this, this author is making the point, that this reliance on this excuse of, we all have to be civil all the time, and this over-reliance on civility, actually has the potential to degrade the quality of our discourse. And that, when we use civility to justify the suppression of speech, you're not being, this is not, that you always have to go along to get along, stay in the Overton window or whatever, just to keep peace and everything, then we're using it inappropriately. So it's, and that's kind of what we're talking about, is that just sort of bullying people into, self-censorship is clearly.
I mean, I've met people who have scientists actually are often the people who do this, who are very bright, and scientists being very bright, they think that they can intuit whole entire fields that are outside of their discipline because theirs is superior to everyone else's, even though they haven't read any other discipline, so they have no basis for making that judgment. But not all, but many of them do that anyway. And they would simply regard going along with critical social justice ideology as a matter of course and as a matter of good manners. And so, it's civility. I'm agreeing with this not because I'm interrogating. Of course I wouldn't interrogate those ideas. That would be uncivil. And that's a very, very chilling kind of shrinking of the Overton window, because it's not the same as a bully who is using it for their own purposes. In many ways, it's much easier to deal with a bully. Because if you know your stuff, you can point out that their motivation isn't what they say it is. You can show inconsistencies in their argument. And you can even show inconsistencies between what they proclaim they believe and the literature they claim to venerate, much of which I've alluded to already. But when you meet someone who is highly intelligent in another field and regards interrogating the kind of things that we're interrogating here as somehow being uncivil and unseemly, and would say the common language, well, I think it's an absolute disgrace that you're questioning these people and that kind of thing, then you're in for something that's very, very, very much more difficult to deal with and actually quite chilling. When it becomes just a matter of good manners.
So there is a little bit of good news, I think, in this paper, that if we can, sort of choose to speak up, if we can phrase choosing to speak up as, in hopes of benefiting others, then maybe we can do it a little bit more. We don't always have to be the champion every time. I think that one of the things that my dad told me one day, I said, I don't understand, I'm the only one fighting the good fight, and this was actually a while ago, before all of this mess. And one of the things that he suggested was that I just ask a question. Does anyone else, have a problem with this? Is there anyone else who would like to keep talking about this? And oftentimes there is someone else who will say, that they would like to keep talking about it, or that doesn't feel that we're finished with this, or that, maybe they do have a problem. They weren't brave enough to speak up, but when they see, it's like, well, I have a problem with this. Does anybody else, does anybody else have any questions about this? And at some point, if people say no, then, it's okay to give up sometimes, right? You don't always have to be the one who's fighting. And so sometimes it's a good strategy. And I have had it work where, you open it up, you leave it open, I guess, leave that window open a little bit further and invite someone else, even just to ask a question. They don't have to make, an outside the window statement, but to simply ask a question, or to say, yes, I still want to leave it open for a discussion or something like that. And that's one of the things that the author here is sort of suggesting. And, he says, my proposal to academics today who find their ideas outside the mainstream or in conflict with expectations or received wisdom is then to introduce into their calculations the potential benefit to others, including unknown others, when deciding whether to speak out or to remain silent. And I think that's a little bit of us.
I'd like to add another little bit of us to this as well, actually, that I think is missing from the article. we exist in the 22nd century, and mercifully we have the internet, which enables people like us to become friends when we never would have known each other otherwise if it wasn't for technology that's out there. And so you can find communities. Finding communities is easier than it's ever been. There are a lot of people who are feeling in exactly the same way that you are, that we are out there right now. And when you are ostracized from the community within which you inhabit on a daily basis, the sacrifice that you have made by standing up to those people may not be appreciated. It may cause your ostracization from that context, but there will be a lot of brave people who exist in other contexts that you can find via the internet who will appreciate your sacrifice and judge you well because of it. That was never possible in the past. It was something that Talkville couldn't have envisioned. Mm-hmm. That is possible now. There are communities of people out there, and you can find them with relative ease. And some of you, by the way, have messaged me on Twitter, which is a nice thing. And it's always nice to talk to you on Twitter, and I try and get back to everybody, who are being ostracized, and you find that yourself in the kind of process of what we talk about here. We'll help you. We'll help you find people. I'll help you personally push back if you want. Don't think that you're alone. 30 years ago, it would have been much harder, not impossible, but much harder to find a community. It's really not like that right now. There's Zoom, Skype, Facebook Messenger, Twitter, all kinds of things. And there are a whole network of people who will hang out with you and talk you through stuff. So,
yeah, I don't know what I would have done.
Likewise.
If it weren't for, yeah. So.
Good. On that note, thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm not sure what we're going to do next week, but yeah. See you later.